In August of 1971, a young man living in Palo Alto, California, heard the wail of police sirens approaching his home. Moments later, real city police officers knocked on his door and placed him under arrest. Neighbors watched as the officers pushed him against a patrol car, searched him, snapped handcuffs onto his wrists, and forced him into the back seat. But this suspect had not committed a crime. He simply answered a local newspaper ad offering $15 a day for male college students to participate in a psychological study of prison life. Everyone involved, from the researchers to the students to the police, knew the setup was entirely fake. Yet in less than a week, this harmless role-play would devolve into actual psychological violence. The study was designed by psychology professor Philip Zimbardo. He and his team retrofitted the basement of the Stanford Psychology Department building, replacing laboratory doors with steel bars and boarding up a dark closet to serve as solitary confinement. The researchers screened over 70 applicants and selected 24 college men who were completely normal and psychologically healthy. Then, by a simple coin flip, half of the men were assigned the role of guards, and the other half became prisoners. Neither group had real authority or criminal backgrounds. If cruelty emerged in this basement, Zimbardo reasoned, it would prove that the environment itself dictates human behavior. On the first day, the volunteers acting as prisoners were stripped of their identities. They were forced to stand naked, sprayed with delousing deodorant, handed ill-fitting smocks to wear, without underwear, and referred to exclusively by ID numbers. The guards received their own psychological armor. They were issued military-style khaki uniforms, heavy wooden batons, and mirrored sunglasses that made humanizing eye contact impossible. This setup deliberately triggered de-individuation, a psychological state where people lose their sense of personal identity and accountability, which dramatically lowers their inhibitions against acting cruelly. By the morning of day 2, the prisoners ripped off their numbers and barricaded their cells. The guards retaliated by blasting the prisoners with freezing carbon dioxide from fire extinguishers and instituting a campaign of psychological harassment. Crushing this brief rebellion established an absolute hierarchy. The guards learned they had total, unchecked power, and the prisoners internalized their complete helplessness. Over the next 3 days, the abuse escalated rapidly. Guards forced the prisoners to clean toilet bowls with their bare hands, subjected them to simulated sodomy, and stripped away their mattresses, forcing them to sleep on the cold concrete. The pressure began breaking the volunteers. One participant, known as Prisoner 8612, fell into a hysterical fit of screaming, crying, and begging to be released from the basement. Even Zimbardo succumbed to the simulation. Acting as the prison superintendent, he spent hours passively watching the horrific abuse unfold through hidden cameras, actively maintaining the facility rather than protecting his test subjects. The experiment had trapped its own architect. The highly trained researchers running the study proved just as vulnerable to the intoxicating pull of their systemic roles as the students they were observing. On the 6th day, a recent Stanford PhD graduate named Christina Maslach came down to the basement to conduct interviews. Walking into the yard, she saw a line of prisoners being marched toward the bathroom. They had paper bags over their heads, their legs were chained together, and they were resting their hands on each other's shoulders to navigate. Maslach confronted Zimbardo directly, stating plainly, "It's terrible what you are doing to these boys." She openly condemned his moral blindness to the suffering happening right in front of him. That single outside perspective shattered the shared delusion of the psychology department. Realizing what he had allowed to happen, Zimbardo abruptly canceled the 2-week experiment after just 6 days. The fallout from the basement triggered a massive overhaul of scientific ethics. It directly contributed to the creation of institutional review boards, or IRBs, which are independent committees that must evaluate and approve all human research proposals before they begin. The published study made concepts like informed consent, the requirement that participants fully understand the risks before agreeing to join, and the absolute right to withdraw without penalty, mandatory baseline standards for modern research. Outside academia, the findings offered a definitive explanation for systemic cruelty. Decades later, Zimbardo even testified in court, using his research to explain the real-world prisoner abuse committed by soldiers at Abu Ghraib. For nearly 50 years, the Stanford prison experiment stood as untouchable psychological canon, a terrifying mirror reflecting how normal people mutate under the weight of authority. But that pristine legacy recently fractured. Modern investigative journalists dug into the Stanford digital archives and uncovered audio recordings that tell a very different story. Prisoner 8612, the student whose hysterical breakdown proved the intense psychological toll of the simulation, later admitted he was faking it. He stated he only acted out so he could get released early to study for his graduate exams. Even more damaging, newly surfaced audio reveals Zimbardo's team explicitly coaching the guards. The warden is heard instructing them to be more cruel. This interference hollows out the paper's core premise. The cruelty was not an organic reaction to the environment, just people following instructions. Whether you view the Stanford prison experiment as a flawless psychological study, or as an unethical, manipulated play orchestrated by a desperate researcher, it leaves behind a chilling truth. It remains a terrifying testament to how easily ordinary people can be coerced into abandoning their humanity.